video series, we are headed in the direction of positional narcissism. But before we can get to positional narcissism, we have to understand leveraged relationship. And a leveraged relationship makes no sense unless we understand relationship as a teeter-totter. So in the second video in this series, I talked about responsibility. And I pointed out that when our working model of the teeter-totter is messed up, we could go one of two directions. We could go toward over-responsibility and helplessness, and we could go to entitlement. And I mentioned briefly the embryonic fantasy. So today what we are going to be talking about is the embryonic fantasy. And I have to admit here, I don't know if I coined this phrase or if I pulled it up out of the depths of my mind after having heard it somewhere else. However, the bottom line is that I'm using the embryonic fantasy as a label into which to group a set of unconscious beliefs that serves to make relationships seem harder than it actually is, because we have this fantasy that we shouldn't have to. We shouldn't have to know. We shouldn't have to say. We shouldn't have to do. My name is Carissa Schulk, and thank you for joining me for this series introducing positional narcissism. Please give this video a thumbs up and share it with friends and enemies alike. When you subscribe to the channel, also be sure to hit the little bell icon and you'll be notified when I post new videos. And in the comment section below, please let me know which points you found particularly useful or meaningful and which points you'd like to see clarified or expanded on in future videos. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram, and you'll find more details in the description either below or beside this video when you click on More below. There you will also find the link to my online store, and I hope you'll visit and make some purchases. At the time of this recording, I have 1 novel and 2 CDs of original music available. To get a feel for the content, be sure to stay tuned because at the end of each video, I'll have a brief excerpt from the novel or one of the CDs. And now, back to introducing positional narcissism. In the embryonic fantasy, we basically believe that we do not have responsibility. Now, you may remember that I defined responsibility as the power to act effectively when effective action is necessary. So the embryonic fantasy doesn't really recognize responsibility. At its core, it's a belief that at one point, and presumably that point would be as an embryo, thus the name embryonic fantasy, that at one point we didn't have to respond, or we didn't respond, and the teeter-totter was just on autopilot. It just went up and down, and we didn't have to do anything. We didn't hunger or thirst. We didn't experience discomfort. We didn't need to cry. We didn't need to speak. We didn't need to communicate. We didn't need to do anything. Everything just happened for us. That's the idea of the embryonic fantasy. Now, I believe that the embryonic fantasy is a human thing, that it's not derived from culture, but probably more likely culture somewhat derives from the embryonic fantasy, in fact. In my experience with Christians, for instance, I've noticed a widespread willingness to sacrifice biblical accuracy in favor of the embryonic fantasy. So we have some pretty fantastic and unrealistic ideas about the Garden of Eden in the past and about heaven in the future. And it becomes pretty easy to just ignore the fact that Adam was created to tend the Garden of Eden and that the Apostle John saw war in heaven, because that doesn't fit our idea of the embryonic fantasy, so we just kind of ignore that. But as I mentioned, I believe that the embryonic fantasy is a human thing, that it exists across all cultures, and we're going to delve into some of the details of it today. You might think of the embryonic fantasy as a fantasy in 3 parts. There's a fantasy about the past, a fantasy about the future, and a fantasy about responsibility itself. So we'll start with the fantasy about the past, and we could equate this with like the Garden of Eden fantasy. So the fantasy about the past is that once upon a time we existed in a state of no responsibility and that everything just happened for us. That when we were embryos, we did not have responsibility. And this is a fantasy. The fact is that embryos are more responsive than adults. This is why it is like absolutely crucial that expectant mothers take very good care of themselves and reduce their stress levels as much as possible. Because one example of the high responsiveness of an embryo is that if I, as an adult, experience stress, it affects my body, but in a few days or a few weeks, I can recover from that and be fine again. But an embryo is so responsive to its environment that if an expectant mother experiences that same stress, the unborn baby is affected by it for the rest of its life. That it actually changes how the baby develops its stress response system. That is amazing, mind-blowing responsiveness. So again, it is a fantasy that as an embryo, we did not have responsibility. We were super, hyper, amazingly, unbelievably responsible at that stage. The second part of the fantasy, as I mentioned, involves the future. We can call this the heaven part of the fantasy. And that fantasy is that it is possible for us to return to a state of no responsibility or less responsibility without sacrificing any of our adult freedom or without pathology. Now, the fact is that healthy development always involves increasing levels of responsibility. Now, I, as an adult, do not respond as rapidly as I did as an embryo, but yeah, I'm responding in different ways. So let me give you an example. In the womb, I did not have responsibility to breathe. My lungs were not expanding and contracting. Once my chest hits the air and I breathe for the first time, it is impossible for me to go back to a state of less responsibility without pathology. Adults or children, anyone who has been born who experiences a reduction in their lung responsibility also experiences a reduction in their overall freedom of movement, and most pathologies that result in a lesser power to breathe result in early death as well. as a child is growing and learning, again, even healthy parenting teaches the child and then allows that child to take on greater responsibility. So you wouldn't, for instance, teach a child how to tie his shoes and then continue to tie his shoes for him. You let him tie his shoes himself because now he knows how. Let's take another example of the responsibility of feeding oneself. Now, as a baby, I didn't feed myself as such. I didn't have to prepare my food. I just cried and then I sucked. And that was all that I did. My mother provided the food. Now, I cannot go back to that state without sacrificing my adult freedom, because I had one option as a baby, and that was breast milk. As an adult, I wouldn't want to have just one option. I want the freedom to eat whatever I have a taste for or whatever I believe to be healthy for me. So I can't go back in responsibility. I can't regress in responsibility without losing my adult freedom. And it is a fantasy if we believe that we can enter a state of less responsibility or no responsibility and still enjoy the freedom that we have as a mature adult. The third part of this fantasy is the fantasy about responsibility itself. And that fantasy basically is, I would be happier with less responsibility or with no responsibility. And that, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, is a fantasy. As I mentioned, it is impossible to regress to a state of less responsibility while still maintaining your adult freedoms. And senility is a good example of this. It is not a desirable state to be in, and it's not a desirable state for anyone involved. Even a person who is senile tends to be unhappy. There's something that recognizes that I used to know things that I don't know anymore. I used to be able to do things I can't do anymore. I used to recognize this person that I don't recognize anymore. There's a lot of confusion and unhappiness in it. There are no advantages to reduced responsibility. So when we want to have less responsibility and still have all of our adult freedoms, that's entitlement. We want it both ways. And we can't have it both ways. That's just a fact. And so our desire to have it both ways, this attitude of entitlement, is one of the things that makes relationships seem very hard. And actually, it can also make relationship hard, because when we have this expectation of relationship, it makes things hard for everyone we're in relationship with. Also, it makes us feel like relationship is harder than it actually is, because we expect it to be we expect to have no responsibility while still having all the benefit that we want. So that makes it feel harder than it is. But then it also makes it hard, the relationship itself hard, because we have these unrealistic expectations. So one of the big things for me, one of the things that I believe lets me know if I'm embracing this embryonic fantasy is the verbal or even the thought, I shouldn't have to. So if I'm thinking I shouldn't have to know what I want, or I shouldn't have to tell you what I want, or I shouldn't have to take hold of what I want, all those are pretty sure signs that I'm getting into this embryonic fantasy. I hope that helps you understand one of the reasons why we can believe that good relationships are hard work. In the next video in this series, I hope to actually begin discussing leveraged relationship, which is one of my all-time favorite things to talk about. And until then, take good care of yourself. You are worth it.
I thought at first that I'd been shot. Odd that the shot tore me out of Stephen's grasp and hurled me through the air in the direction from which it had come. Odd that I could feel the breeze the explosion made many seconds after the fact. Odd that I could feel a heartbeat that was not my own. I hadn't been shot. I realized that in the same moment I realized that it was Samuel who had torn me from Stephen's grasp. The same second I knew I was going to die anyway. I thought, he'll crush me, he'll land on top of me, and I won't survive the impact. A moment before we landed, Sam twisted his body so that instead of landing on my face, we landed on his left shoulder with me half facing him. Fabric ripped, but if the flesh beneath was torn in the process, he gave no indication of it. He continued to roll as we skidded along the ground, so when we stopped, I was on my back and he was above me, his weight on his elbows and his big body shielding me from the gunfire. There was chaos all around. Samuel blocked it out marvelously well. I could see the short bristles on his neck and chin, but little else from where I lay. I didn't care. The rest of them could take care of Stephen. My fingers found the canvas of his shirt near his waist and gripped it. It was real. He was real. I saw him swallow, felt him take a couple quick little breaths, and then one big one. Footsteps pounded all around me, past me. I didn't even turn my head to see the feet go by. Shouts bounced around inside my head, along with gunshots, and I didn't know what was real and what was merely echo. I didn't care. I wanted only to go home.